The primary American weapon in the Battle of the Atlantic was the Mark 9 depth charge. On paper, it was a 600-pound steel drum of pure TNT. It was a tool of annihilation, designed to crush the hulls of Germany's U-boat wolf packs with a single, overwhelming hydraulic shock. Its testing ground was a 1,000-mile stretch of ocean that sailors called the Black Pit. This was the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a dead zone in 1943 that lay beyond the reach of Allied air cover from Newfoundland, Iceland, or Britain. It was a graveyard. Here, U-boat wolf packs were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built, choking the life from Great Britain and threatening the entire Allied war effort. In this crisis, the Mark 9 depth charge, the official, mandated solution, was a catastrophic failure. This is not the story of a weak weapon. It is the story of a weapon that was too powerful, and a doctrine that was fundamentally, suicidally blind. It is the story of a fatal paradox. The one tool designed to kill the U-boat was the U-boat's single greatest tool for escape. The failure was not in the explosive. It was in the physics of the attack. Imagine a destroyer escort, the United States ship Ellison, hunting in the dark. Its ears are its ASDIC sonar, a delicate system that pings and waits for a faint echo. A contact is made. A U-boat, 800 yards out. Now, the fatal doctrine begins. To attack, the Ellison's captain has no choice. He must order an increase in speed. He must run directly over the U-boat's last known position and roll his 600-pound charges from the stern. At the single most critical moment of the engagement, the destroyer must sever its own sonar contact. It is now deaf, running blind. Then comes the explosion. The 600 pounds of TNT detonate, not just at the enemy, but under the destroyer itself. This is the problem. The blast creates a reverberation wall in the water, a hydraulic cataclysm that strikes the Ellison's sensitive sonar transducer. The ASD operator's screen does not show a kill. It goes white with noise. The ship's ears are gone. The Ellison is blind and deaf for 5, sometimes 7, critical minutes as the reverberation fades. The U-boat commander knows this. He is trained for it. The explosions are his starting pistol. In those 7 minutes, a U-boat moving at 8 knots can be half a mile away. He can be anywhere inside an escape radius of nearly 3 square miles. The result was a statistical nightmare. The kill probability of a full 10 charge pattern was less than 5%. The Ellison's crew, and hundreds like them, were not hunting. They were punching holes in the water. The Mark 9 depth charge was not a U-boat killer. It was a 600-pound smoke bomb that covered the U-boat's escape. The United States Navy's admirals saw the field reports. They knew the statistics. So why did they continue to enforce a doctrine that was guaranteeing the enemy's survival? To understand this fatal paradox, one must look not at the ocean, but at the men who wrote the rules. To understand this fatal paradox, one must look not at the ocean, but at the bureaucratic dogma that made it necessary. The source of the problem was not a flaw in steel, but a flaw in thinking. It was a failure personified by one man, Rear Admiral Marcus Vance, the head of the United States Navy Ordnance Board. Vance was a man of iron will, an architect of American industrial sea power. He had built his formidable reputation on a single, unassailable doctrine: overwhelming barrage. He believed wars were won by tonnage, by the sheer, crushing weight of American manufacturing. To him, the 600-pound Mark 9 charge was not just a weapon. It was a statement of national superiority. He received the same statistical field reports as everyone else. He saw the catastrophic failure rates, the kill probability of less than 5%. He actively suppressed them. In Admiral Vance's official position, the weapon was perfect. The fault, he argued, lay with the men. The missed kills were the result of poor crew training, substandard sonar operation, or a simple lack of aggression in destroyer captains. He rejected all evidence to the contrary. The British Admiralty, desperate to close the Black Pit, had already offered a solution. It was a weapon called the Hedgehog. It was a forward-throwing mortar, a strange device that launched 24 small charges in an arc in front of the ship. Critically, these charges only exploded on contact with a U-boat. No contact, No explosion. No explosion. No blinding the sonar. Admiral Vance had personally blocked its adoption. He dismissed the weapons as British toys, mere fireworks. Their existence was a slight against his authority, and an insult to the American-made Mark IX program. This denial had a price. The convoys, the jugular vein of the Allied war effort, were bleeding out. Sinking rates were approaching 600,000 tons a month, while Britain required 1 million tons of supplies per week to survive. The math was failing. Out on the line, the men knew the truth. The crew of the United States, ship Ellison, a destroyer escort, understood the fatal math perfectly. They were a shepherd assigned to protect convoy SG-119, a vital shipment of fuel and munitions. They were exhausted, fatalistic. They had a name for Admiral Vance's doctrine. They called it punching holes in the water. And on the Ellison, one man understood the acoustics of that failure better than anyone. His name was Lieutenant Eli Thorne. He was the sonar officer for the Ellison, but he was not a career Navy man. He was a reserve officer, one of the thousands of civilians who had brought their peacetime skills to the war. And Thorne's skill was unique. In his civilian life, he was a brilliant acoustics engineer. He had not just been trained to operate the ASDIC. He understood the fundamental physics of how sound moved through water. This expertise was his personal torment. Every time the Ellison went on a hunt, Thorne was a man of science forced to participate in a ritual he knew was flawed. He was a sound expert, listening on a multi-million-dollar system, who was forced, by doctrine, to become deaf. Every order to drop a Mark IX was an order to pollute his own sensor array, to fill his headphones with the white-hot roar of their own violence. He knew the Mark IX was a sledgehammer in a game that required a scalpel, and he carried the proof of that failure with him every day. It was a memory that haunted his sleep. The memory was of convoy HX-228 just 2 weeks prior. It was 2, in the heart of the Black Pit. An alarm had shattered the quiet. Torpedo hit, port side. The Indiana sun is hit. Thorne had been at his station, his headphones pressed tight. As the tanker erupted in a bloom of fire on the horizon, Thorne's hand was steady on his dial. He was hunting, and he found it. Ping. Echo. It was not a guess. It was a fact. A clear, solid echo from a metal hull, 800 yards off the port bow. He had the U-boat. He guided his captain perfectly onto the target. His voice a calm instrument in the chaos. Target bearing 015, range 800 yards. Speed 4 knots. This was the moment. The by-the-book captain seized it, ordering exactly what Admiral Vance's doctrine demanded. Right full rudder. All engines ahead full. Stand by for depth charge run. Thorne felt the deck shudder as the Ellison's engines roared to life. In his headphones, the U-boat's delicate echo was instantly obliterated by the sound of their own propellers. The first deafness, the ship charged forward, blind. Charges away. The Ellison thundered over the target's last known position as the Mark IX seconds rolled off the stern. Seconds later, the ocean heaved. The concussion slammed the destroyer sideways, a series of dull, bone-jarring thuds. On the bridge, Thorne heard the distant sound of cheers. A perfect 10-charge pattern. A certain kill. But Thorne was not cheering. He was listening. In his headphones, beneath the 7-minute-long, deafening roar of their own explosions, he heard something else. It was faint. It was arrogant. It was impossible. Ping. Echo. The U-boat. It was unharmed. It was 1,000 yards away, checking its escape path, brazenly using its own sonar while the Ellison was still blind. It had slipped away in the noise, completely untouched. The U-boat was gone. But the Indiana sun was not. As the Ellison circled back, its sonar screen now quiet and empty, the radio crackled to life. Thorne was forced to listen to the tanker's radio operator, a young man the crew called Sparks, screaming for help. He screamed as the fire reached the radio room, as his ship broke in two, and as the Atlantic Ocean rushed in. Thorne sat there, frozen in a cold, terrible clarity. It was not poor crew training. His contact had been perfect. It was not substandard sonar operation. He had tracked the target precisely. It was the weapon. Admiral Vance's doctrine, the entire overwhelming barrage philosophy, was a lie. And the voice of Sparks, screaming into the void, was the price of that lie. Thorne's realization was a cold, sickening weight. The loss of the Indiana Sun was not an accident of war. It was not a tactical miscalculation. It was a predictable outcome, an execution of a flawed system. The men on that tanker had not been killed by a U-boat. They had been killed by their own doctrine. To understand the failure, one must first understand the tool. The ASD sonar was a delicate instrument. It was a listener. Inside its underwater housing was a sensitive crystal transducer, a device designed to send out a single, clean ping of sound and then listen. Listen for the faintest, most fragile whisper of an echo returning from a distant metal hull. It was an act of acoustic subtlety, a search for a needle in an oceanic haystack. The Mark 9 depth charge was the opposite of subtle. It was a 600-pound drum of TNT. It was a wall of noise. It was a sledgehammer. And it was being used in a task that demanded a scalpel. The failure was twofold. First, there was the tactical flaw, a contradiction so perfect it was almost insane. It was called the blind run. Because the charges were dropped from the stern, a destroyer had to accelerate. It had to charge past the U-boat's last known position to get its weapons on target. At the exact moment of greatest certainty, when Thorne's headphones gave him a perfect, solid echo, the captain was forced to sever that contact. The rules of engagement demanded that the hunter blind himself at the moment of the kill. Then came the physical flaw. The detonation of a Mark 9 was not a simple boom. It was a cavitation event. It did not just create an echo. It created a massive, churning bubble of superheated gas and vaporized water. This bubble would expand and collapse, creating a reverberation wall, a chaotic barrier of noise that would persist for minutes. This was the source of the 5 to 7 minute deafness. The sensitive crystal of the ASDIC was overwhelmed, rendered useless by the sheer violence of its own ship's weapons. And the U-boat captains. They knew this. They were trained for it. They counted on it. For a U-boat commander, the American destroyer was not a hunter. It was a loud, predictable alarm clock. His tactic was simple. 1. Fire torpedoes at the convoy. 2. Dive deep. 3. Wait for the destroyer's high-speed propeller sounds as it began its blind run overhead. 4. Wait for the inevitable, massive booms of the depth charges. Those explosions were his starting pistol. The moment the Mark 9 seconds detonated, the U-boat commander knew he was free. He had 7 minutes of guaranteed, total immunity. He could move at his top underwater speed of 8 knots in any direction, confident that the destroyer above him was completely deaf, lost in its own self-inflicted noise. The math was damning. 7 minutes of blindness at 8 knots gave the U-boat an escape radius of nearly 1 mile. By the time the Ellison's sonar screen cleared, the U-boat could be anywhere inside a patch of ocean covering almost 3 square miles. This is why the kill probability was less than 5%. It was not a hunt. It was a lottery. And why was this absurd ritual allowed to continue? Why did the doctrine not change? Because Admiral Marcus Vance, in Washington, D.C., was not measuring success in kills. He was measuring it in explosions. His overwhelming barrage dogma saw the 600-pound blast as the goal, not the problem. He was treating a surgical crisis with a sledgehammer. And in the deafening noise, the U-boats were quietly, professionally, slipping away. The Ellison limped into port at Derry, Northern Ireland, a ship haunted by failure. The crew was demoralized, granted a few days of shore leave before their next run as shepherds for convoy SG-119. But for Eli Thorne, there was no escape. The memory of the Indiana Sun was a ghost that followed him ashore. The screams of its radio operator were a permanent echo in his mind, a sound that no amount of whiskey in a crowded pub could silence. He found himself in a smoky officers' club, surrounded by men trying to forget the Black Pit. It was there he met a Royal Navy counterpart, a destroyer captain with weary eyes and a deep, simmering anger. This man had lost 2 brothers to the wolf packs in as many months. They spoke of the war, of the losses, of the statistical nightmare of the Mark 9. The Brit listened, and he recognized something in Thorne. It was not just the despair of a fellow officer. It was the cold frustration of an expert. He realized Thorne was not just a sailor. He was an acoustics engineer. "You're not just a sailor, then," the Brit said, his voice low and intense. "You're a man who actually understands sound." A decision was made. "Come with me," the Brit said, stubbing out his cigarette. "There is something you need to see. Something your Admiral Vance is blocking." He led Thorne through the damp night to a restricted Royal Navy warehouse, far from the main docks. With a key, he unlocked a heavy padlock and pulled back a massive canvas tarp. There it was. It was not a weapon of overwhelming barrage. It was strange, almost delicate. A steel frame holding 24 slanting spigots, pointing up and forward. "We call it the Hedgehog," the Brit said. Thorne, the engineer, understood its genius in an instant. The Brit confirmed his thoughts. "It throws 24 small charges forward." Thorne's mind raced. Forward. It meant they could fire while still holding sonar contact. They would not have to make the blind run. They would never, ever be deaf. "And this," the Brit said, tapping one of the small, teardrop-shaped bombs, "is the part that matters. They only explode on contact. If they miss, they just sink. No contact, no explosion." He leaned in, his eyes locking on Thorne's. No explosion, no blinding the Azdic. Thorne was stunned. It was the solution. It was the scalpel. It was the answer to the entire fatal physics problem. But why don't we have this? Why isn't this on every ship? The Brit's face darkened. "Because your Admiral Vance calls them British toys. He refuses them. He would rather his men punch holes in the water than admit his precious Mark 9 seconds are a failure." That night, the Royal Navy officer found Thorne before he returned to his ship. He pressed a heavy roll of documents into his hands. "These are the installation blueprints. It's a court-martial offense for me to give them to you, and for you to possess them." The Brit held his gaze. "Vance will never approve this. But maybe a man who actually understands sound will." Thorne was back on the Ellison, alone in his cramped quarters. The blueprints were spread across his bunk. This was the moment. This was the crack in the system. He was a reserve officer. He was not a rebel. He knew what these papers represented. This was not a minor breach of regulations. This was the illegal, unauthorized modification of a commissioned warship in a time of war. The penalty was clear. 20 years in Portsmouth Naval Prison. His own captain, a good man but a by-the-book commander, would report him instantly. He would be in irons before he could even mount the first steel plate. He stared at the plans. On one side of the choice, his career, his freedom, his oath to the chain of command. On the other side, the cold, hard physics of the Mark 9, the 5% kill rate, the 7 minutes of blindness, and the voice. The screaming voice of Sparks's from the Indiana Sunday. Thorne looked at his hands, the hands of an engineer. He realized that following orders was the one thing guaranteed to get more men killed. The true insubordination, the true failure, would be to do nothing. He could not do it alone. He needed a man who understood the ship's guts as well as Thorne understood sound. He went deep into the ship, to the engine room, and found his chief machinist. He laid out the plan. He did not have to convince him. The chief had lost his best friend on the Indiana Sunday. The conspiracy was born. It was an act of heresy, performed in whispers and shadows. For 48 hours, while the Ellison was docked in Derry, Thorne and his small team of conspirators, the chief machinist and 3 trusted men from the engine room worked against their own ship. They labored at night, using the noise of the docks as cover. They scavenged parts, trading whiskey for scrap steel and welding equipment. This was not a professional installation. It was a jury-rigged, desperate act. They used a cutting torch to carve a space in the bow, hiding their work under a heavy canvas tarp. They bolted the Hedgehog launcher directly to the deck, a cancerous growth of foreign metal. The most dangerous part was the wiring. They bypassed the ship's main fire control system, entirely a profound violation of naval law. They ran a separate, shielded cable from the bow, through sealed compartments, directly to Thorne's sonar station. He alone would have the trigger. It was ugly. It was unbalanced. And it was completely, dangerously unauthorized. The machinist team gave it a name. They called it the British contamination. When the Ellison departed port, it was a ship divided. The officers on the bridge saw only a destroyer escort, preparing to execute the same flawed doctrine. But Thorne, at his station, and the machinists, deep in the hull, knew they were a different ship. They were a ticking bomb, smuggling a forbidden solution into the heart of the Black Pit. They steamed west, escorting the precious line of merchant vessels, convoy SG-119. The first night passed. Then the second. The air in the sonar room was thick with a tension only Thorne could feel. The blueprints were hidden. The trigger was cold beneath his hand. On the third night, it came. A sharp, clean sound in his headphones. Ping. Echo. It was a solid contact, 700 yards off the starboard bow, moving to intercept the convoy. This was not a guess. It was a certainty, and the target was not just any U-boat. Thorne recognized the voice of its propellers, the signature of its movement. It was U-441, a notorious ace, a Wolfpack leader responsible for sinking over a dozen ships. A master of the Mark IX 7-minute escape window. On the bridge, the captain's voice was a clarion call to action, ringing with by-the-book confidence. He gave the order that every man on board expected. Right full rudder. All engines ahead full. Stand by for depth charge run. The ship's alarm bells sounded. The deck shuddered as the engines roared, and the Ellison began its high-speed blind run, turning to charge over the U-boat's position. Thorne watched his ASDIC screen. The clean echo of U-441 was already dissolving in the noise of their own high-speed turn. He saw the Indiana Sunday. He heard the voice of Sparks. This was the moment. His thumb was on the hidden switch. He flipped the comm override, his voice cutting through the bridge's chain of command. Captain, I have a new solution. Trust me. Hold your course. The bridge was stunned into silence. The order was incomprehensible. It was open insubordination in the middle of combat. The captain's face turned white with rage. Mr. Thorne, you are. But Thorne did not wait. He yelled into his private line to the bow. Fire! 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 Before the captain could react, before he could stop the act of mutiny, a strange sound cut the air. It was not the boom of the main guns. It was a hiss and a thump. From the hidden canvas on the bow, a pattern of 24 small mortar bombs arced up, flying forward of the ship, landing in the water 200 yards ahead. And then, silence. The ASDIC screen was perfectly clear. There was no 600-pound boom. There was no reverberation wall. There was no 7-minute blindness. There was only the ship, moving slowly. The convoy, vulnerable. And the clear, sharp echo of U-441, still 700 yards away, unharmed. The captain was apoplectic. This was not just failure. It was a betrayal. He grabbed the bridge microphone, his voice shaking with fury. Mr. Thorne, you are relieved of duty. Master-at-arms, go below and arrest that man. The master-at-arms was halfway down the ladder, his hand on his sidearm, coming to arrest the insubordinate lieutenant. On the bridge, the captain was sputtering with rage, his ship frozen in the water, a sitting duck, but in the deep, dark water 700 yards away. The commander of U-441 was in a state of shock. This was not how the game was played. The American destroyer had not made its blind run. It had not accelerated overhead. It had not dropped its deafening barrage of 600-pound charges. It had stopped. And its ASDIC, which should have been silent, was still pinging him, relentlessly. The hunter was not blind. The hunter was still listening. The U-boat ace, the master of the 7-minute escape, realized he was not in a hunt. He was in a trap. In a single, desperate, panicked move, he did the only thing he could. He fired a torpedo down the throat, a bow shot, aimed directly at the source of the ping. He would kill the Ellison before it could kill him. In the sonar room, Thorne was waiting for the click of handcuffs. Instead, his headphones erupted with a new, terrifying sound. It was a high-pitched, mechanical whine, the sound of an incoming torpedo. The bridge lookout screamed it at the same time. "Torpedo in the water! Bearing 005! Closing fast." The ship's alarm bells exploded. This was the crisis. The captain, all thoughts of insubordination gone, reacted as he was trained, shouting the only order that made sense. Hard to port. Evasive maneuvers. All engines back full. The deck began to shudder as the ship prepared to turn and flee. But Thorne, staring at his screen, knew they could not run. The Hedgehog's bombs were still sinking. They were 10 seconds from their target depth. To evade now was to miss. This was the one and only chance. The master-at-arms was at the hatch. "Lieutenant Thorne, you're under." Thorne ignored him. He grabbed the comm switch, his second act of mutiny, his voice cutting through the ship-wide alarm. "Hold course, Captain. Hold course. He's in the pattern. Hold your course." It was madness. A junior officer, already facing arrest, was ordering his captain to steer into an oncoming torpedo. The ship hung in the balance, half-turning, its crew frozen by the contradictory commands. The whine of the torpedo was louder now. 10 seconds to impact. The captain lunged for the comm, to shove Thorne's channel offline and save his ship. And then a new sound came. It was not the 600-pound boom of a Mark 9. It was not the single, cataclysmic blast they were all expecting. It was a series of 4 distinct, sharp cracks. They were hard and brutal, the sound of a hammer striking an anvil, the sound of metal tearing metal. On the ASDIC screen, the screen that should have been white with noise, the image was perfectly, beautifully clear. Thorne watched, his breath held, as the sharp, solid blip of U-441 simply collapsed. It blossomed into a cloud of noise and debris, a smear of an echo, and then nothing. The hull had imploded. The U-boat was gone. In his headphones, the high-pitched whine of the torpedo went silent. The sonar man next to him, his face pale, ripped off his own headphones. Torpedo track is gone," he stammered. "The target. Sir, the target is gone." The Ellison floated in the dark. The enemy torpedo, its guidance system dead, passed harmlessly 20 yards to port, a ghost in the water. On the bridge, there was a profound, stunned silence. The master-at-arms slowly lowered his hand from his pistol. In the sonar room, Eli Thorne finally let go of the comm switch. His British contamination had worked. The heresy was the truth. The British contamination was no fluke. And it was no longer a secret. As the Ellison continued its patrol, escorting convoy SG-119 through the most dangerous waters of the Black Pit, the ship's entire atmosphere changed. The fatalism was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal confidence. The crew now moved with the quiet focus of true hunters. Twice more, Thorne's ASDIC picked up a contact. Twice more, the U-boats, expecting the blind run, were caught in a trap. There was no more debate. There was no more insubordination. The by-the-book captain now simply deferred to his sonar officer. He would maneuver the ship into position, and then quietly give the order. "Mr. Thorne, you may fire when ready," and Thorne would fire. There was no 7-minute blindness. There was no chaotic barrage. There was only the hiss of the mortars, the brief silence, and then the hard, sharp cracks of a hull imploding. 2 more U-boats, 2 more Wolfpack leaders, were eliminated. The attacks were not even battles. They were executions. When convoy SG-119 arrived in the relative safety of the River Mersey, steaming towards the docks of Liverpool, it did so with its formation intact. Every tanker, every munitions ship, every single vessel arrived without a scratch. 0 losses. In the brutal calculus of the Battle of the Atlantic, this result was not just a victory. It was an impossibility. It was a statistical miracle that sent an immediate shockwave through Atlantic Command. Convoys always lost ships. It was a given. The Ellison's success was not just a data point. It was an accusation against every other ship still using the Mark 9. The truth was now impossible to hide. The Ellison's captain, back in Derry, was a man trapped by his own principles. He was a by-the-book commander who had witnessed, and even participated in, a profound act of insubordination. but he was also a man of honor. He had to report the kills, and he could not lie about how they were achieved. He sat in his cabin, staring at the blank after-action report. To credit the Mark 9 would be a lie. To ignore Thorne would be a lie. To ignore the Hedgehog would be a lie. He picked up his pen and wrote the truth. He detailed the failure of the Indiana Sun 2 weeks prior. He detailed the blind run doctrine, and then, in crisp, damning, factual prose, he detailed the 3 kills of U-441 and the others. His report became the smoking gun that would change the war. It read, all three U-boat kills achieved on this patrol were executed with an unauthorized, forward-throwing mortar, designated Hedgehog by the Royal Navy, installed without authorization by sonar officer Lieutenant Eli Thorne. The report landed on the command desk in Derry like a lit grenade. This was not an anonymous statistical report that could be buried. This was a direct, signed accusation from a veteran captain, citing a specific officer and a specific, forbidden piece of hardware. The news was too loud to be contained. It did not just proliferate, it exploded. It tore through the officers' clubs, the dockyards, and the command centers. The Ellison did what? They have a what on their bow? And it works? The other escort commanders, men who had all lost friends to Admiral Vance's doctrine, were electrified. They saw Thorne not as a mutineer, but as a savior. They besieged the Admiralty, waving the Ellison's success like a banner. They were no longer requesting a new weapon. They were demanding it. The official lie of the Mark 9, the foundation of Admiral Vance's entire career, was crumbling. The signal was too loud to ignore. In Washington, D.C., Admiral Vance received the cable from Derry. This was not a rumor. It was an open rebellion, sparked by a single, irrefutable report. He could not suppress this. He could not blame poor crew training when the crew had achieved a 1 to 100% success rate. He had to go to Derry. He had to confront this contamination himself and personally crush the man who had dared to be right. Admiral Marcus Vance arrived in Derry not with a sense of curiosity, but with the cold, controlled fury of an empire striking back. He did not come to learn. He came to restore order. His first act was to board the USS Ellison, still docked, the crew standing at a tense attention. He walked to the bow, flanked by aides. He did not ask questions. He simply stood and stared at the British contamination. The ugly, jury-rigged mortar, now covered in rust and sea spray, was a monument to his failure. It was a physical, steel accusation, proving his entire doctrine was a lie, his prized Mark 9 a failure. His face, a mask of iron, revealed nothing, but his eyes were like ice. He convened a formal board of inquiry that afternoon. It was not an investigation. It was a show trial. The room was heavy with the weight of rank. Admiral Vance himself presided, his chest a solid wall of ribbons, his authority absolute. Lieutenant Eli Thorne, the sonar officer, the acoustics engineer, the man who had saved convoy SG-119, was called to testify. He was no longer a mutineer, he was an engineer. And he had come prepared. He was calm, professional, and armed with irrefutable scientific proof. He laid out the evidence, piece by piece, as if addressing a university panel. First, he presented the ASDIC recordings from the Indiana Sun Patrol. "Here, Admiral," Thorne said, his voice steady. "This is the sound of the Mark 9 detonation. As you can see, it creates a 7-minute-long wall of total deafening reverberation. We were blind." Second, he presented the new recordings. "And here is the U-441 engagement. This is the Hedgehog. The screen is perfectly clear. During the attack, we never lost contact. The target had no escape." Finally, he presented the kill reports, the logs from the Ellison's captain, and the simple, damning math. The 5% probability of the Mark 9 versus his 100% success rate with the Hedgehog. The room was silent. The other officers on the board looked down. The evidence was absolute. Thorne had not just proven a U-boat could be sunk. He had proven why the Mark 9 was failing. He had exposed the flaw at the heart of the system. Admiral Vance listened to it all. He looked at the charts. He looked at the sonar graphs. He saw the irrefutable truth. And in that moment, He made his decision. The judgment was read the next day. Admiral Vance, the board announced, acknowledged the potential of the forward-throwing mortar concept. However, the facts of the case were a matter of discipline. Lieutenant Eli Thorne was found guilty of gross insubordination. He was found guilty of the illegal modification of a commissioned warship. He was found guilty of endangering his vessel and crew by bypassing established combat protocols. The punishment was swift. Lieutenant Thorne was grounded, effective immediately, confined to the base to await further disciplinary action. The order was final. The British contamination was to be cut from the Ellison's bow with torches and scrapped immediately. The ship was to be restored to regulation. The rebellion was over. The system had won. But the cover-up was just beginning. Admiral Vance classified Thorne's entire report, all the ASDIC recordings, all the data, all the proof as top-secret ordnance. It was buried in a Washington vault, far from the eyes of any inquiring captains. Vance then flew back to Washington, D.C., carrying Thorne's stolen data. He convened his own ordnance board, this time in private. He did not present a British toy. He presented a new, revolutionary concept, an American innovation based, he claimed, on his own recent research. He called it Project 14B. It was, of course, a perfect, blueprint-level copy of the Hedgehog. With Thorne's irrefutable data as proof of its effectiveness, the board, loyal to their admiral, approved it for mass production. 6 months later, as the new, American-made Project 14B launchers began arriving on destroyers across the Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Marcus Vance was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. He was celebrated in newsreels as the visionary, the genius, the man whose research had finally solved the U-boat problem and won the Battle of the Atlantic. And so, the enforced silence began. For Eli Thorne, the threat was absolute. He was given a choice that was no choice at all. In a cold, windowless office in Derry, a superior officer laid out his options. If he spoke, if he told anyone, another officer, a journalist, his own family, what had happened, Admiral Vance would not pursue a simple charge of insubordination. He would pursue a general court-martial for treason. The charge would be colluding with a foreign power to illegally modify a warship in a time of war. The Royal Navy officer, who had supplied the blueprints, would be implicated. It would be an international incident, and Thorne would be its sacrificial lamb. He would be ruined, his family's name destroyed, and he would spend the rest of his life in Portsmouth Naval Prison, if he was lucky. The alternative was silence. Thorne chose silence. 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. Lieutenant Eli Thorne was quietly, bureaucratically discharged from the United States Navy. The official reason, the lie that would cover the entire affair, was medical reasons. It was a clean, elegant solution, a single line of ink that erased his service, his heroism, and his inconvenient, irrefutable truth. He returned to his civilian life. He went back to his old firm, back to his old desk, back to his work as an acoustics engineer. This was his burden. This was the true weight of the cover-up. He was the man who understood sound, the man who had solved the physics of the Black Pit, and he was forced to live in a world that was celebrating a lie. He watched from the sidelines as Project 14B, his weapon, the British contamination in an American uniform, was rolled out across the entire Atlantic Fleet. He read the papers as the U-boat kill rates, once a dismal 5%, skyrocketed. The Hedgehog was winning the war. And then, he was forced to watch the newsreels. He sat in dark theaters and saw the face of Admiral Marcus Vance, hailed as the visionary who had broken the wolf packs. Vance was the hero. Vance was the man of genius. Vance was the savior of the Atlantic. Thorne would simply sit in the dark, his hands clenched, his scientific mind a prison, holding the truth that he could never speak. He was a ghost, forced to watch another man wear the accolades for his own defiant, brilliant act. The silence was not his alone. The entire crew of the United States ship Ellison was forced to carry the secret with him. They, too, were reminded of their oaths. They were visited by officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence, reminded of the Official Secrets Act. They were forced to sign non-disclosure forms, binding their silence to their service records, their pensions, and their honor. They knew the truth. They knew that the official hero was the man who had almost cost them the war. They knew that the miracle weapon was a piece of stolen, jury-rigged hardware, installed by a mutineer who had been erased from their ranks. The true story of the Ellison, the real story of Convoy SG-119, and the act of insubordination that had finally turned the tide in the Black Pit was buried. It was locked away in a classified vault in Washington, and it was locked inside the memories of the men who were forced, for a lifetime, to forget. The silence that Admiral Vance imposed lasted for 50 years. The men of the Ellison carried that secret with them, some to their graves. Eli Thorne lived out his life as a civilian engineer, a man who had held the key to the Battle of the Atlantic and had been punished for using it. He died in 1988, never having seen his name cleared, and never having spoken of what he did. But a lie, even one classified as top secret, cannot survive forever. In the 1,990 seconds, long after Thorne and Vance were gone, the files were finally declassified. The truth came out, not in a single explosion, but in a quiet, steady stream of paper. The Ellison's original after-action report, Thorne's meticulous sonar recordings, and the angry, revealing memos from Atlantic Command demanding to know why the Hedgehog had been suppressed for so long. History has now been rewritten. The official record is clear. Historians no longer credit the Mark IX depth charge with winning the war. They credit the Hedgehog, the British toy that Eli Thorne proved, as the single most important technological innovation in the Allied victory over the U-boats. Admiral Marcus Vance is now a historical footnote, a case study in the catastrophic cost of ego and bureaucratic inertia. And Eli Thorne, the insubordinate sonar officer, has finally been vindicated. He is the unrecognized hero of the Black Pit, the man who understood the physics of sound, and who was brave enough to defy a system that was scientifically and morally wrong. We have now declassified this file and delivered justice to the man who deserved it. But this story, Thorne's story, poses a final, haunting question that echoes far beyond the 1,940 seconds. How many other lives have been lost, not to the guns of the enemy, but to the systems we build to protect ourselves? How many other brilliant, life-saving solutions remain buried, locked in a filing cabinet, simply because the right people would be proven wrong? And how many other Eli Thornes are out there right now, men and women who see a fatal flaw in our own doctrine and who are forced to make that same terrible choice to remain silent or to commit an act of heresy? This is the kind of history that is often buried deepest. These are the inconvenient truths, the stories of heroic insubordination that powerful systems try to erase. Here, our mission is to find them. We exist to declassify these files, to investigate the cover-ups, and to give voice to the heroes who were silenced. If you believe, as we do, that these stories must be brought to light, then subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to hunt for the truth, pull back the curtain on the official lies, and honor the men and women who dare to be right.